Now, if you will make sure that your phones are set to silent so that everyone can enjoy the presentation, I will tell you a little bit about tonight's speaker. From 1985 to 2016, Ian MacLaren taught at the University of Alberta in the departments of English and Film Studies, Canadian Studies, and History and Classics. He was also an adjunct professor at the Canadian Circumpolar Institute. He has published many articles about Arctic exploration, early Canadian literature, the history of national parks, and exploration and travel writing, which of course is the subject of tonight's talk. He has authored, co-authored, and or edited, I believe, five books? 5 books, Ian? Is this your 5th? Can't tell you. Too many to count. But he's going to tell us about his most recent book tonight, about Paul Kane. So without further ado, please welcome to the stage, Ian MacLaren.
Good evening, and thanks very much for coming. It's a real pleasure to come to this particular venue, and I'm so glad to have the chance to introduce this book in Ottawa at the RCGS. I appreciate the invitation. I want to tell you about Paul Kane, more interesting figure than the one that was there, right? And a little bit about travel writing, and then get into the geography of his travels in the 1840s. 1840s, important to remember. Across a lot of Canada, from Lake Huron to the Salish Sea. And he did that initially in 1845 on his own, but at Sault Ste. Marie was turned back by a thoughtful fur trade factor who suggested he could get a lot farther west if he got a letter of permission from the Hudson's Bay Company. And that's something he did in the winter of 1845-6 in Toronto in order to continue in 1846-8 all the way to the Pacific and back. The remarkable thing about the case of Paul Kane, if you're a student of exploration and travel writing, is that 3 different stages of his narrative have survived. That's not normally the case. And it was quite often the case that explorers and travelers were only one-time authors, and because they were helped into print if they ended up reaching book publication. And that thereafter, their field notes or any manuscript leading towards publication would be disposed of. That was routine. And being helped into print often involved the ability of ghostwriters or editors, as we would call them today. That was very common. What's uncommon, I'll emphasize again, is that the Kane narrative has 3 versions. Perhaps the only well-known one is Wanderings of an Artist Among the Indians of North America, which details these travels in the 1840s. It was published in London in 1859, luckily in February, because by the end of that year, it would have had to compete with Francis McClintock reporting the findings of the Franklin Expedition searchers, which more or less put paid to the end of the missing tragic Franklin voyage. That came out in December, but so too did Darwin's Origin of Species. So he would have been up against it if he'd published earlier in the year. Prior to that, in the early 1850s, in 4 hardback notebooks, there is a proto-narrative of a book, not yet divided into chapters and lacking lots of the content that's in Wanderings of an Artist, and not written in Kane's hand. Written in 2 hands, neither of them Kane's, nor his wife Harriet's. I've eliminated 24 likely possible individuals without identifying those hands. Unfortunately, they're both typical of the mid-Victorian period and being in round hand, so they weren't meant to be distinguishing. They were meant to be generic in their appearance, and to that extent are difficult to identify. Portions of it appeared in a Toronto newspaper, 2 different papers, and 3 papers appeared in the Journal of the Canadian Institute through the 1850s. they more or less resemble the draft manuscript's version of the narrative. And then we have 2 chest pocket-sized, more or less, field notebooks of Kane's writing kept while he traveled. And these are in the museum called the Stark Museum of Art in easternmost Texas. If you leave the town of Orange and go a mile east, you're in Louisiana. So that's where they ended up. That's a long story. And these are this is the only stage of the narrative in Kane's hand. This is also the only stage of the narrative, very important to note, that does not contain pejorative references to Indigenous people. Kane was a curious sketcher and painter, seemed to have no problem being around Indigenous people, didn't look down his nose at them. There's one description talking about the hideous faces around a campfire. Perhaps to an artist, the lighting from below of the flames could have created the impression that would have sponsored that adjective, although it didn't have the negative connotations that it does today in Victorian speech. But gradually, as the narrative evolved, Indigenous people take on a pejorative cast, such that by the publication stage, every one of the 25 chapters of the book contains a purple patch. That's what we in literary studies call the sensational part of a chapter. That almost always features Indigenous people, being what I end up calling 5 V's Indians. Now, Indian is a term I'm borrowing from the Chippewa poet Gerald Visner, who spelled it all in italics and in lowercase letters to draw attention to the artificiality of the name, so that he could draw attention to the constructedness of the representation of Indigenous people by Euro-Americans. And then I've added to it the memorable title, 5 V's Indian. Vain, vengeful, violent, vicious, ultimately vanishing. And this is what dominates Wanderings of an Artist. Even though that's the case, I've kept it as the base text for my book while presenting my transcriptions of the other 2 stages. In any one chapter, therefore, my reader is able to compare the version of the narrative that each of them provides and how different they are from one another. So to get you going on Paul Kane himself and how he wrote, let's have a look at this particular page from 1845. When he leaves Penetanguishene on the 20th of June for Owen Sound on board the steamboat, and then he left room for the name of it, but never wrote it. I met 3 gentlemen who were going to Saugeen to attend a council of chiefs of the Indian nations. We hired men to carry our baggage and got a guide at the Indian village. That's the village of Nawash, just outside Owen Sound. So they're making the crossing of the Bruce Peninsula, then called the Indian Peninsula, from Owen Sound over to Saugeen on Lake Huron. And this is the way Kane wrote. I want my reader to know that, and so I've used each of the end papers of each of the 4 volumes of my book. This one here, a copy of which is upstairs. And Roy Ward, the sales manager for McGill Queen's University Press, said, I am not going home with that copy of the book. So I don't know who of you will publish or purchase it tonight. But so 16 end papers in the course of the 4 volumes provide reproductions of pages of Kane's own writing. Because it's hard to get used to. Now, why did he write this way? Well, his father wouldn't educate him. He wanted to be a painter. I was in Edmonton a couple of weeks ago and mentioned that to 2 painter friends, and they said, oh, the same old story. Won't educate them because he wanted to be nothing more than a painter. And that was Paul Kane's opinion of his son's ambition. So he got no formal education, so he tended to write phonetically, or at least oddly, to our eye, at any rate, and was a candidate for being helped into print as a result of this. My book has 6 maps, fold-out maps in volume 1, and then repeated as needed through the course of the other 4 volumes, detailing Kane's route. So think of it as a history of Canada in 6 maps rather than 10. And I'm going to dwell for a few minutes on the Lake Huron portion of Kane's travels. And that shows you, obviously, Penetang here, and then across the water over to Owen Sound, and then on he went to across the Bruce Peninsula over to Saugeen. Why? Because Anishinaabe chiefs leaders were meeting there to determine whether or not it might be a good idea for them to try to convince their people to all resort to the Indian Peninsula, given how overrun a number of their communities were already being by settlers in the arable part of southern Ontario. In the event, they decided that that wasn't a good idea, but they were all meeting there. Kane wanted to sketch Indigenous leaders, obvious place for him to go. Once he heard about that, he made his itinerary to include it. And here's what he wrote. So I've read the first part, and I'm continuing now. I got as far as the guide and started on foot. So here's my transcription. Across the portage, some 30 or 40 miles, it's actually 26. There was no road, but an Indian trail. We camped in the woods the first night and arrived the next day at Saugeen, both wet and hungry. Saugeen is a beautiful place that is situated on a high bank overlooking a river of the same name. It has about 200 Indian inhabitants. And then the payoff is these fabulous sketches of the various leaders. Metigwab on the left, and Musconongi, or Big Fish, often translated as Big Pike. We know these men from the historical record in other regards as well. And this was Kane's bread and butter, as it were. Kwakwada Nuaskong, Dawn of Day. And I've just reproduced Kane's writing down at the bottom of that sketch. All these sketches are also in Texas. Because Kane never studied anatomy, and so he had a hell of a time with animals and even full-length portraits of people. But he was really good, really competent at the bust portrait, shoulders and head. And he'd made his money in towns on the Mississippi River in the 1830s, early 1840s, painting portraits of successful businessmen and so on, in the era just before the advent of photography, where all of that got replaced by a different technology, and he couldn't have been able to make his living any longer doing that. He was also a good student of dwellings of Indigenous people. I want to show a few of these pictures of lodges, wigwam, made either out of mats or bark or indeed canvas, that he sketched in Nawash in the Owen Sound area, and then over in Saugeen. So back to the field notes, because now I'm going to take you a little farther along his route. He went through the 30,000 islands of Georgian Bay in a canoe with someone named Dylan. Not sure exactly which Dylan that was, but obviously another Irish Canadian whom he knew or came to know. And they made their way to Manitoulin Island. And this is what he wrote. You can make it out. On our way to Manitoulin, we passed through some most delightful scenery. For 200 miles, there's nothing but islands. It's said there is 3,000 of them, 2,700 has counted. We were 14 days in those islands. Manitowaning is the name of one of the Indian villages on the great Manitouling Island, and obviously never got the name Wikwemikong, is the other. There were 1,850 Indians which received presents here. I stayed here 2 weeks, and on the war steamer, the Experiment, for the Sault Ste. Marie when he left. And that's all he was writing in 1845. He learned, obviously, when he got back to Toronto that winter, that he didn't have enough records even to document whom he was portraying. So he actually got comparatively verbose from 1846 to 48. But these are pretty sketchy notes. So now we're going up to Manitoulin Island, and here's an inset in map 1 that shows Little Current today. Usually the places in red are names we have, but that were not used in Kane's day, whereas black ones like Manitowoc and Wemacong were in use. And I'm going to feature Birch Island in a minute. But momentarily, here's his sketch of Manitowoc, where the annuity payment was being paid by the British to various people of the Lake Huron area, Ottawa in particular, and Ojibwa. But Potawatomi and Menominee would come from Wisconsin, where Kane went next, and then they go back to Wisconsin in the fall and collect money from the American government too, till finally someone decided that the double dipping was probably not a great political practice. So from the water, Kane's sketch showing the village when it's so full of people coming for the payment. Remember that Manitoulin had been turned into this enclave of possible refuge for Anishinaabe in particular. Sir Francis Bond's idea was to get people away from white civilization, which was killing and ruining them, and providing them with this refuge. Lots of people didn't want that in the 1830s, and it was a fairly romantic idea that natural man should be preserved from civilized man. So it didn't really fly, but that's where the payments were occurring. Now have a look at this, because I want to emphasize how how representative Kane is as a sketcher. First, the warehouse on the shore, and here's a picture of it today. If you go to Manitowoc, it's still there. Obviously, it's been rebuilt more than once since 1845. And again, the lighthouse up on the hill, and then again, just that year, the Anglican Church was built. Didn't have its spire yet, as you can see, but there it is, and the sign showing you that it was built in 1845, the year that Kane was there. This is the Manitowoc mission of the Anglican Church, Church of England, that began in 1838, lasted to 1864, was historians judge it as a failure, ultimately. But here in these three images, details of this image, we've got Kane showing us that he's capable of being representative rather than impressionistic. Okay, and then he's really good with the Ojibwa canoe. This is one sketch that he showed back in Toronto in 1848, the only one of 240 that he didn't color, just in graphite, and it's exquisite, really well rendered. He met there Siganak, the famous Odawa interpreter, who remained loyal to the British, and you know, Siganak is the name of the museum in Manitowoc. It's the name of a township on Manitoulin Island. It's the name of a school in Barrie, Ontario, usually spelled Asiganak rather than Siganak as it is here. Blackbird is usually the translation of his name. Azabonish, raccoon, and his daughter, who are also Ottawa. You can see Kane, AH-TAW-WAH, as in Ottawa, Ontario. And then Makata, who's Ojibwa, and then Abamweshkum, who's also Odawa. He met all these people at Manitowoc and sketched them, often in oils in 1845, because he had the winter of 45-6 back in Toronto where he could do the coloring, but more often in his later travels in watercolors. And then George Ironside Jr., who supplied his durum at the bottom of the sketch, the turtle, who was the Indian agent. His father was Scottish. His mother, we think now, was Wyandot. And Wyandots were settled in what's now Ontario, but eventually left partly because Ironside took half their land. He wasn't a great asset to Indigenous people while he served as Indian agent, which he began doing in 1845. And Shah Anasui, whom I've used on the cover of Volume 1. I want to feature him in particular because he was a prominent leader. If we go back for a moment to the map. Excuse me while I get there. He controlled land from Popham Point, which is, as you can see, on the other side of Killarney Provincial Park, all the way over to about the La Cloche River on the North Shore. And indeed, his people, Whitefish River First Nation, have traditional lands on Manitoulin as well. It's their wind farm, for example, that's located just about here when you come off the Highway 6 from the north, Espanola, down onto Manitoulin. It's the Whitefish River's wind farm that you see. So the sketch on the left, and then on the right, the Royal Ontario Museum owns the canvas rendition. Invariably, although not so pronounced in this particular case, Kane would make noble savages out of the people whom he sketched, generically transforming them into something that somebody would want to hang on their parlor wall in the 1840s or 50s. I'll get to the anatomy of the changes, but you can see that the man on the right's been to the dry cleaners and he's been to the barber shop and so on and so forth. But in particular, have a note of his eyes. He's just not as alert. It's a more vacant look and less attentive, less alive, if you will. I had a chance on the 1st of October. My wife and I went to Whitefish River First Nation where I talked to the kids at the school and then in the evening at the Elder Center. And I did this at the invitation of Esther Oshie, who's holding a copy of Volume 1 here. This is the school's portrait of Shah Anasui. This is the name of the school, Shah Anasui School on the reserve. He's a memorable historical leader of this Ojibwa people. And he signed the 1836 Bond Head Treaty. He signed the Robinson-Huron Treaty in 1850. And he was an old man at that time. And you know, probably following the news, that the Robinson-Huron Treaty has just been through the Supreme Court. And the payout is finally occurring because Canada stopped paying an increasing amount yearly to the people who signed it in 1879. So it was still only $4 that they were getting, right up until the Supreme Court's ruling that more had to be paid to them. So he was a signatory of that, and in 2022, Esther, who had been exhorted by her grandparents to keep the story of Shah Anasui alive, was given the permission of her people, including Chief Pabomsi, to let the traditional story be told in my book. So Volume 1, page 214, you can find her version of the story of this man, and it's so different from what he becomes in Wanderings of an Artist, where he's the villain in a love triangle. There's no greater Victorian schlock than what happens in chapter 1 of Wanderings. And he kills off the other suitor of the maiden, who flees because she's terrified of him. And before he reaches her in a rainstorm, she's ripped apart by a pack of wolves. End of story. So folklorists know this as the kind of lover's leap legend. Usually they go over a waterfall, but ripped apart by a pack of wolves, second best, I guess. anyway, the people at Whitefish River were alarmed, but also delighted to know about this sketch, because all they have in the hall of their school is the ROM's reproduction. And of course, you probably all know that the ROM's not exhibiting any of their canes. They stopped doing that in November 2022. Toxicity of identity politics in museal circles being what they are these days, they don't want canes shown, period, which I think's, I don't think it's too bad, I think it's wrong. And I'll explain at length later if you wish. Okay, now I'm dragging you out of that context because believe it or not, I'm going to take you right to the ocean, to the Pacific. So let's get going. This is a really good rendition of Fort Frances in northwestern Ontario today, with international falls, which is now today impossible to see. Couchiching, or the falls that produce their own rain, the spray being significant from them. And that's why we have Rainy Lake, Rainy River. Those names derive from the waterfall, which Kane captured in this rendition. And then I'm taking you in, I'm sorry, the maps in my book don't blow up really well for projection. But think of yourself, think of that green dot as Kenora, Ontario. So we've come out down Rainy River and Lake of the Woods to Kenora at the top of the lake, and outflow of it is the Winnipeg River. And now we're coming down the Winnipeg River. And the reason I want to dwell here at the Royal Geographical Society of Canada's theater is I want to dwell for a moment on a river that no longer exists because it started being dammed in 1911. So these are wonderfully important historical renderings that Kane did of various water features. This one, Pointe du Bois, or Woody Point, or Oak Point, is the name of these falls of the Winnipeg, which seems just to flow right through the islands in the middle of the river. Really dramatically rendered by him. He's not a great landscape painter, but this, I think, probably is his finest oil on paper sketch, at any rate, of the river. And what's fascinating historically is that Kane chose a point of view that was almost identical to one chosen 20 years earlier by George Back, whom some of you will recognize was part of this the overland Franklin expeditions and had his own voyage in the Arctic as well, and was a competent, like most Royal Navy sketchers in rendering landscape, but not people. So 20 years earlier, in 1825, when the second Franklin expedition was making its way from Montreal up to the Arctic, here's Back's rendering of the same falls. And you can see he sketched in the romantic bystander here, but he always left it to another naval officer named Batty to supply the figures in his works. Anyway, this is from Back's sketchbook. Also from 1823, and by 1824 as a lithograph, we have Samuel Seymour, an American sketcher's rendition of a different perspective. So the river's coming down here and then it flows over here. And this is the island that you saw in the previous two works. So these two compare quite nearly to one another compared to Seymour's, at least in the woodcut version. I've never seen the original watercolor. And now we come to the next fall, also gone, long gone, thanks to power dam construction, Slave Falls. And here we don't have the same point of view. I think Kane must be over here somewhere. This is his rendition, looking across at the bank that Back has given on the right side of his sketch, both in watercolors. They both handle white quite well. In both Back's and Kane's renderings, it's the not painting of the paper rather than the use of gouache, which is memorable. A couple more renderings are the same as Back's. This is William Henry Edward Napier from 1857, the first expedition of We think of them as the hind expeditions to the Canadian prairies. On his way, he overwintered at Fort Garry. So we know this sketch was made in 1857. And then John Arnott Fleming from 1858 on the second hind expedition. So clearly there were aesthetic points in the river that drew the eye of people who knew how to sketch landscape. And it's wonderful that we have this historical record that, as far as I know, hasn't been collected before as far as the Winnipeg River is concerned. It's also really hard to find photographs of that river prior to power dam construction. There's 7 hydro dams on the Winnipeg. So even in 1977, when Eric Morris was trying to plot the canoe routes of Canada then and now, you might know that book, he had a hell of a time figuring out where everything was on the Winnipeg. It depended on water levels too, which account you consult to determine where portages occurred. Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the prairies. Really apologize. Can't be done. Can't do them all. And Kane's associated with the prairies in particular. The reason is this. Many of his oil paintings, which of course the ROM has, it has all 100 that Kane painted for the commission that it was given him by George William Allen, a prominent Torontonian, who paid him $20,000 in 1853 to paint him 100 canvases. Might be the largest private commission a Canadian artist has ever had, when people could live on 100 pounds a year and it was $5 to the pound. That was a lot of money. Anyway, that's what the ROM has. It has sketches too, but not the best of them because the best selection was made by Kane's widow after Kane died. Another long story. But across the prairies we go. Kane was pretty good at the prairie parkland, and this is his rendition of Fort Carleton, which if you go up onto the North Saskatchewan from, say, Saskatoon, is about an hour's drive. That's where it's located. There's a provincial park there today, but there isn't a village particularly close to it. But a beautiful rendition of the parkland. Here's another one. Showing that Kane was quite attentive to detail. He recorded best when he wasn't in a hurry, but once he was traveling with brigades in 1846 and 47 and 48, he often didn't have a choice about what he was given time to sketch. But because they're in August now, early September, there's probably not a lot of water in the North Saskatchewan. At points, there's obviously dragging, and so we know that even as at Fort Pitt, Kane took a horse to Edmonton thereafter. It was simply faster than the brigade was able to travel on the river. And then here we come to Edmonton. This isn't a well-known, this graphite sketch isn't nearly as well-known as the watercolor, which is here, out of which the castellated version of Fort Edmonton was painted by Kane in the oil version that seems to be reproduced everywhere. But this one, I don't know if you happen to know Edmonton. It's about where McNally High School's football field is, looking down on the river and the Indigenous encampment down on the Rossdale Flats, as they're known today, and then up. If I had a picture here showing you the legislature, it would be of Alberta. It's on the higher ground, and then across the river, the University of Alberta. That gives you the bearings. But historically fascinating sketches. Now, keep mentioning that. And now I'm going to take you from Fort Edmonton. The normal route by the 1840s was by horse for 5 days up to Fort Assiniboine on the Athabasca in order to cross the mountains. Why? Because the North Saskatchewan ends up at glaciers, at the Columbia ice field. It's no way to get over to the Columbia River. Whereas the Athabasca, although it too comes out of the Columbia ice field, it's the Whirlpool River, its tributary, goes up to Athabasca Pass, and where there is no glacier, and then down through the normal fur trade route, and this starts in behind Mount Edith Cavell, took people down to the Columbia. So this is Kane's first rendition of mountains coming out of the boreal forest on the Athabasca River. And this widening is called Lac Brûlé, or locally Brule Lake, and Solomon Creek coming in from the right. This very distinctive image is of Roche Miette, which everyone who lives in the area, Hinton, Edson, they know they're in the park, or they're soon coming to it when they see Roche Miette. And this is called the Bedson Ridge, Black Cat Mountain. I'm going to start emphasizing now, because of what happened last summer, just how much more. So here we have Roche Miette, and this this dotted line shows about the perspective along Brule Lake to Roche Miette of that previous image. There's a photograph of it, and while there's lots to say about it aesthetically, let me emphasize instead the vegetation change. And I mean, Kane's traveling through in late October, so not much snowfall on the Front Range at that time of year. And so his rendition of this as far more open is really symbolic of what has happened in Jasper Park since it became a forest park in 1907. The suppression and prevention of fire, building up valleys that are wall-to-wall green, beautiful, and what many, many people regard as wilderness in terms of appearance, was the death knell for the town site in the summer. Fur traders refer to the upper Athabasca Valley as savanna. So grasses and meadows, not trees and forests. A regular burning by Indigenous people for the very good reason that it would bring down animals from the heights to feed on new growth. But that fire was part of the ecosystem. It wasn't Smokey the Bear like prevented from being part of it. And so the fuel density, that plus of course the devastation of the pine beetle, which left a lot of dead wood on the forest floors, made for the perfect storm that we had last summer. So back to those two images, and now a few more pairs, and keep vegetation in mind as we go through them, if you would. Here are the Palisades. You can't quite see it, but or not easily, but here's the Athabasca River in the middle ground, and Kane's on the other side. If you know Jasper, it's around where the horse stables are at Moline on the other side. Here's the lower Palisade. There's the upper, somewhat exaggerated in height, and there's Pyramid Mountain on the left. And a photo of it today. And the north fire, or the downstream fire that blew into Jasper, started at the power station, this is Powerhouse Cliff right here. And it was an ignition that happened there. It wasn't lightning. Something went wrong, and some guy leading a tour group, a Cree man leading a tour group, saw the flash that started that fire. And there's the forest ready to be consumed. And then I'll take you to the next, which is farther upriver near the town site. But in the meantime, here's an image from late October of this year that someone who did photography for my book, a local Jasper man, Kevin Hassan, took to show, well, if you're a golfer, you're still okay. But otherwise, everything's lost. Not all of Jasper Park Lodge, but some of it was torched. And the next set of pictures I'm going to show you has this point of view looking over at this bench. This was not burned. And so, yeah, looking across the Athabasca River, this is Kane's rendering of it in 1846 with Pyramid again in the background. And what it was, I think most of that, you could probably take that picture again in season because the burning that happened downriver of the town site tended to be on the Jasper Park Lodge side of the valley. But that fire, and this shows it particularly well, that fire has made Kane's pictures all that more significant now. Here's Whistlers. If you've been a tourist in Jasper, you might know that it's Whistlers you go up to get on the gondola. And this is the point of view of it. There's the gondola station at the top there today. And this wetland at the bottom. The one license that Kane took happens to be visible in this picture. As you can see here, there's mountains. There aren't, you can't get that easily, or they aren't anywhere near the same proximity to the Whistlers. It's called the Victoria Park Range, or the Victoria Cross Range, and you have to go higher up towards the Five Finger Lakes to get any indication of those peaks. They're not nearly as close to Whistlers as Kane's rendering provides them. Okay, well, now we're going next to Athabasca Pass, which has a tarn at the top of it named Committee Punch Bowl, named for the London Committee of the Hudson's Bay Company. Its waters flow in both directions. It sits astride the actual international divide. Sorry, the continental divide, and was named by the time that Kane traveled. Also, you see Mount Kane here, Kane Meadows coming up the Whirlpool River, the tributary. And after Committee Punch Bowl, these two creeks, Jeffrey and Pacific, feed the Wood River, which comes down to the Columbia. The Columbia comes up from Golden, makes this hairpin turn, and goes down to Revelstoke. But now, of course, with Mica Dam, this is all a huge reservoir, and that part of the fur trade route's gone. Here's Mount Kane in the left, looking south at the north face of it from Kane Meadows, and on the right, looking north at the south face of it with Kane Glacier beneath it on the left center. So Kane Creek, Kane Meadows, Kane Glacier, and Mount Kane, all named for this painter. And here we have his rendering of Committee Punch Bowl in late November, covered in snow, of course. That's more or less the same perspective with a summer photo. Next, we're going to go down the Columbia. So come down this part here. Kane's on his way to Fort Vancouver, which is across the river from the city of Portland, Oregon. Fort Vancouver, Washington is its name. That's where the Hudson's Bay Company had its biggest entrepot on the Pacific slope, although it was in the progress of moving it in 1846 because Kane actually crossed the international border 6 months after the Oregon Treaty was signed. And Britain gave up, didn't ever really express a lot of interest in owning more than, say, the 49th parallel on the Pacific slope. It had already had its hands full with a number of rebellions, including the one in Upper Canada in 1837. The empire wasn't paying for itself, essentially. The last thing Britain needed was more land. And so although President Polk, in a kind of pre-Trumpian move, was blustering for 5440 or fight, 54 degrees, 40 minutes north latitude, which is up around Prince George, BC. They settled at 49, continuing the border that had already been agreed on for the prairies. This is Dalle des Morts, Rapid of the Dead, because of the number of drownings that occurred on it. And we happen to have, from the 1930s, a photo from a more or less the same point of view by William Dickey of Revelstoke, showing the river. This was the fastest big river in North America. And the fact that at points like this, that's only 30 yards wide, would give you a good idea not only of what it was like to go down it, but what grueling work was involved in going up it. So perhaps it's good at this particular venue to suggest that up in Athabasca Pass, where there's something named for the governing committee of the HBC, There's another tarn on the Alberta side, apparently, I'm told, too small to garner a name, that we ought to name for the engagés who did all the work, who had, you might know from other sources, they had a per diem ration of 8 pounds of meat. That's how many calories they were burning. You can't call it slavery, but it was indentured labor, but it was punishing work. And if you couldn't get horses over, as in 1846, you couldn't because the brigade was late. It was late because of plagues in Red River and down in York Factory, gastroenteritis in particular, delayed the whole move of the brigade that Kane was on. And so they came late into the mountains, and so the horses had to be left on the Alberta side, as it were, and snowshoes taken. And that made the work all that much more arduous. And then, of course, when they went in the other direction, they had to go up water features like this. And you can see it's almost impossible to line the canoes. There's nowhere for footing. It's unbelievable. And again, because the Columbia is now gone in terms of hydrography and water features because of the Columbia River Treaty of 1964 that turned the river more or less into puddles for hydro dam construction, that it's almost impossible, apart from these images, to get an idea of what was involved in the labor of going down and up them. Okay, I'm going to bring you down to Kettle Falls on the Columbia River, which is in Washington State. Here's the international border. Just before they crossed it, they came to the Little Dalles, and the Little Dalles had a sufficiently powerful whirlpool that it could take a canoe down easily. And it happened time and again. Here's a photograph from 1915. You can see a canoe here that escaped it. This was the big water feature, and everyone knew to stay the hell away from it if they could. And they often portaged around it going upstream. But remarkable that the same point of view was adopted by a photographer the better part of 60 years later. Another water feature long gone, the great salmon fishery on the Columbia River, Kettle Falls. Each of these points had its own Indigenous name. And because peoples from all over, Pont d'Oreille, Kalispell Lakes, Nez Perce, Spokane, Colville, Kettle Falls people, Shuapa, came from near and far to fish at the salmon fishery. Everything was regimented, everything was organized, everyone had his place. Whether they were fishing by spear, which was less common, or these baskets. I might be standing in your way. Kane made a few studies of these J baskets, and of course here he's showing some fish going upstream. So Kane actually saw in September 1847, he saw that fishery in operation, and his is regarded as the only really detailed and full record that we have. So this is the portion that was in his sketch from a 1930 photograph showing Tumaxt is the name of the promontory on which much of the fishing was done. Okay, now I'm taking you all the way, I promised I would, to the Pacific Ocean. And this is map 6, is a pretty detailed map. In fact, it needed to have an inset within an inset to talk about Victoria. Eby's Landing is on Whidbey Island, which is in the San Juan Islands, part of Washington State. And this is the neck of the whole of Puget Sound, which extends, of course, for a couple of 100 kilometers and has the cities of Tacoma and Seattle on it. But this is the neck where it enters into Juan de Fuca Strait, better known or regarded now as the Salish Sea. It's a place where Kane met a Clallam encampment called Toanicham. And these are its various constructions, including these guards for protecting by bow and arrow attack from particularly northern peoples who came down and raided Salish people. So whether it was traditionally the case or whether the fur trade and the arrival of Europeans to trade with various peoples made the difference, there was a lot of enmity when Kane traveled between the people, the Coast Salish people, that's Saanich and Cowichan and Clallam and Songhees and Esquimalt and Snohomish and Snohomish and Nisqually and Rainier and other peoples from the Quagioth or the Kwakiutl or Kwakwak from northern Vancouver Island and Haida Gwaii, who would routinely come down and raid, and they invariably took hostages because they used them as slaves. And one of the reasons why their head formation was altered culturally was so that they would distinguish themselves from the round-headed people, which included their slaves from farther south, but also white people whom they regarded as useful to trade with, but not quality people. I want to show you Mount Douglas, which of course is in the Greater Victoria area, in Victoria, BC. And that's in the inset, but cross the water of Harrow Strait onto the San Juans and then over to the mainland. And you've got Mount Baker over here. And that's an image that Kane chose to sketch. So we've got Mount Baker from Mount Douglas, the park at Mount Douglas Park in Victoria. And there's a photograph showing Cordova Bay here and Cormorant Point, if you know Victoria and its environs, on Mount Baker on a good day over in Washington State. There's the two of them together. Sorry, I feel as though I'm blocking the view from one side. It was the last time a book on Kane was published. Russell Harper's fabulous book in 1971. He located the point of view as Gordon Head, which is not quite right. But I shouldn't leave you with the impression that I think anything other than I regard Harper's book on the highest possible terms. He did wonderful work in a very short time. He had a 30-month contract from the National Gallery, from Jean Sutherland Boggs, to produce not only a book about Kane, but also an exhibition that toured 6 cities, and that I can't imagine will ever happen again because of change of museum policies. You probably know this sketch of the Inner Harbor at Victoria, which shows 2 very distinct people's dwellings. On the right, Fort Victoria, which started building as Fort Camosun in 1843, got renamed in 1846. Kane visited it in April 1847. That's important for a reason I'll come to. And then on the other side, Songhees Point, which is the easternmost extension of the Esquimalt Peninsula. The Royal Ontario Museum's reckonings are always call this the Esquimalt village. It's not. It's the Songhees village on the eastern end of the Esquimalt Peninsula. And Kane did numerous studies of the housing there. But I like this picture in particular because it shows at a time when different cultures were equitable and trading with each other, and one didn't tyrannize or dominate the other. Here they are living together. I won't say in peaceful harmony, although it happens to have peaceful water in the picture, but things were working in the 1840s in a way that they began not to once settlers wanted land. It's the same old thing that land is shared, and it's a being that you live with if you're Indigenous. But as soon as it becomes private property, it's something else entirely. And that's what Western thinking, thanks to Locke and other philosophers, were bringing to North America. We could go on at length about that, but it's not particularly geographical. And then there's Cordova Bay there in Mount Douglas. Okay, and now we're going into the inner harbor of Victoria. James Bay is its name. You can see where the BC legislature is. And I guess if it was on the map, right beside the Y would be the Empress Hotel, which seems to be better known than the legislature. And Songhees Point across the way. So this is the historic marker, the spindle and the whorl of Indigenous weaving. This is the whorl is cast, and this is a cedar spike for the spindle. And it's looking across the bay at Songhees Point, which is residential now, but was industrial in the 1870s. The land had to be left for a long time before it could be reclaimed and built on for some other purpose. But it's over there that, believe it or not, the name of a street, Paul Kane's Way, survives. The sign hasn't been torn down yet, but there's no statue of Kane in Victoria either. In case you need your bearings, this is where the fort was, just to the right of the knife of the Red Fish, Blue Fish restaurant, temporarily closed, and Songhees Park and the condominiums there, that if you have more money than brains, you're welcome to buy. Back to this picture, and then to Kane's notes. Here it gets particularly interesting. You see note number 44 on this full page, and then the blow up of it on the right, naming Chiklach, or Shikla, who's the Songhees leader. And who number about 500 warriors. They live on the south end of, I think I have the transcription of this here from my book. The south end of Vancouver's Island in the Straits of De Fuca. I crossed the straits with this chief and 4 of his tribe. And he did, that's in the next chapter. The draft manuscript preserves that identification. I won't ask you to try and make it out from that. I'll provide my transcription as well. So we still have Chiklach as the head chief of the Songhees. There's the introduction of the fact that they're a flat-headed Indian. That is to say, they had the cultural practice of shaping a child's head at infancy. And that didn't make them flathead Indians. Flathead Indians didn't have that practice. The confusion started early and it persists. But they're a Plateau Salish people. They're nowhere near the coast anyway. Numbering about 500 warriors and living in a village situated at the southern end of Vancouver's Island called the Esquimalt. Okay, so we're not over in Esquimalt Harbor where the Royal Canadian Navy has its base. We're at the eastern end of the Esquimalt Peninsula. All right, and then we come to the rendering of this in Kane's book in 1859. And on pages 209 and 210, I'm coming down here, but I've just excerpted it in my transcription, which is a facsimile where I've retained the page breaks, but not the line breaks. It's a village of Klallam Indians. They boast of being able to turn out 500 warriors. So who made the change? And it matters today. In the 1840s, Klallam tended to be generically used. So Salish people on the coast were sometimes called, as they were by James Douglas, who of course tried to organize the Vancouver Island treaties a few years after Kane was there. And so that's a possibility. But today, of course, it does matter. So back in 2005, when the Lekwungen people, who are the Songhees and Esquimalt, took BC and Canada to court, saying that they'd never been paid for the land on which the BC legislature sits. The lawyers for BC and Canada were using as evidence that the land had not been Songhees and Esquimalt land the fact that Wanderings of an Artist Among the Indians of North America, Paul Kane's Eyewitness Observer journal, as the first pages of that book declare, said, no, 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 it was Clallam Indians who can boast 500 people. And I happened to meet at a conference two husband and wife who were doing research for one of the for the law firm that was representing the Songhees. Said, this is really interesting. There's more than one version of the Kane narrative. Would you mind looking to see if, I'm sure it is, it's Clallam and Kane's own field writings? And I said, yeah, I'd be happy to look. I hadn't noticed before, but you know, when I reported to them the discrepancy, they quite properly said, okay, thank you. Can you give us the evidence? And I had to get the Stark Museum in Texas to provide, at the time, they hadn't digitized anything, a photograph actually showing the page that I just showed you. $31.5 million later, that suit was settled out of court in 2006. Now, we're talking about a different kind of geography when we're talking about land rights. But nevertheless, I think that there's probably a possibility that the Kane narrative will factor again in this. I know it was used by the law firm that settled the Saugeen dispute out of court as well, just 2 years ago in Toronto. And it may happen again. This isn't brilliant scholarship by Ian MacLaren. What I've done is laid bare what was sitting there to bring to the surface. And if that's of use one way or another, these two researchers, Randy Bouchard, Dorothy Kennedy, they often work for the government side of cases too. That's why they're sought after, because they're regarded as objective. They're not playing favorites. But yeah, they were really delighted to find out that this discrepancy had a bearing on the case they were working on at the time. Here's Kane's picture, a sketch of Giaclach and his Royal Ontario Museum painting. I keep saying Royal Ontario Museum. They didn't commission, George Allen did. But when he died, his family sold his Kane paintings to Edmund Osler, who was one of the people who established the Royal Ontario Museum. And so what happened in 1914 was that the collection of Kane's paintings became the foundational collection of art in a museum of archaeology and geology and Egyptology. And suddenly they acquired the patina of scientific authority in that surrounding. And so these were regarded as ethnographically accurate. And while there's nothing particularly ethnographically inaccurate about the garment the man's wearing, the fact that he's turned into a noble savage, here's how in particular. You want to make someone elevated looking. After all, what does noble mean? So you elongate the neck, you make the face slender, and you provide a background that's got some attitude. As in, you can read the eyes and the lips in part because of the color of the background. If it's not brooding, it certainly is a stated background. It's not a neutral one. And that routinely is what Kane did with eyes. The sketch shows the man looking directly at him and somewhat askance, haughty maybe, in the studio oil. The mouth doesn't curl into a sneer in the studio, but remember, Kane doesn't have the man in front of him in Toronto on King Street East. And so he renders him in a way that he knows is recognizable. Okay, I'm almost done, but I'm gonna close with another interesting matter. This is a photo of Daniel Wilson, the archaeologist, actually he was a polymath, who came from Edinburgh to the University of Toronto in 1852, and he befriended Kane. And in his book, first published in 1862 in 2 volumes, and then again in 65 and again in 76, a very influential book called Prehistoric Man in anthropological circles. He uses a lot of Kane's artifacts, Kane's anecdotes, and Kane's pictures in his book. And this woodcut on the left is from prehistoric man, and it shows, as you can read, annuity chief. And this is the sketch from which it was, the woodcut was made. In fact, you can see at the bottom of it, both in graphite and then in Paul Kane II, his black ink handwriting, woodcut, head and shoulders only, and Paul Kane 1846, that's the wrong date. Paul Kane II marred many a sketch trying to identify everything in them. It's too bad, but there it is. And then we know from the sketch number, Kane's writing in graphite in the upper left-hand corner, the number 65, tells us that if we go to the portrait log, we can find on 65 annuity chief. Okay, they live on the north end of Vancouver's Island, and yeah, make their heads a conical shape. Let me get to the transcription. Yeah, I'll do that in a moment. I'll be back to you. The 1848 exhibition of 240 sketches that Kane was persuaded to mount upon his return to Toronto, probably the finest collection, exhibition we'll ever know of Kane's work. The manuscript catalog was written by his girlfriend, Harriet, whom he married 5 years later. And then Hugh Scobie, who was the editor of the British Colonist and was a great promoter of Kane, published the catalog for an exhibition that lasted 9 days. And the 143rd entry, annuity chief north of Vancouver's Island. The Annuity Indians have conical shaped heads is the entry for this sketch. And the number 143 is written in graphite on the verso of the sketch in Kane's hand. So no problem identifying this one. But Stark Museum of Art in Orange, Texas calls this man a Nootka. And in the studio rendition, again, you can see the formula at work that produces a noble savage out of this man. The Royal Ontario calls him Nootka. Now, I don't know when this confusion started, but you can see in the Radisson Society edition of Wanderings in Arts, the first Canadian edition that appeared in 1925, there was in the front matter a list of the pictures at the Royal Ontario, and it clearly shows that 98 is a annuity, an Indian with a conical shaped head, chief of Annuity Indians, and prehistoric man is the reference because that's the woodcut that I showed you. And of course, that's based on the watercolor that became the studio oil that the ROM's calling Nootka. Okay, well, if we go back to my crazy map 6, well, not crazy. I mean, I was so relieved when we finally got a good map maker who could tackle all of the names that I needed for my reader. Okay, well, here's Nootka Sound, here. If you go straight across, you can't, but if you were to go straight across, you'd be at Campbell River on the Georgia Strait side of Vancouver Island. Whereas Nawati River, Nawati Lake, Nawati Mountain are all up at Cape Sutil at the north end, which is about 300 kilometers as the bird flies north of Nootka. These are different people. These are not Nootka people. They are Nawati people, or Nuati, as Kane wrote the name. Someone at some point decided that they were one and the same and corrected Kane's spelling, because after all, it needed correcting in many, many cases. But in this case, got it wrong. And who knows what the repercussions of that are? Who knows if people think that Nootka used the sugarloaf formation, head formation at all? If they were using Kane's, you see the ramifications time and again? Wanderings of an Artist was used by Herbert Spencer at the start of the discipline of sociology. He said, we need data. And he assigned a team of people to read books and produce a 20-volume work, and the 6th volume on North America. Its Northwest Coast section has excerpts from many, many sources, but No source is used more often than Wanderings of an Artist. 30% of the excerpts, 30% of Herbert Spencer's data for the foundation of sociology are based on passages and wanderings that have no basis in Kane's field writings. You know, someone who probably never went farther west than the Hammersmith flyover in London created passages that are in the Script of Sociology is the name of the 20-volume work. All this and more is in the 4 volumes of Paul Kane's travels. I thank you for your attendance and your attention.